Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I've seen a bald, pale-skinned creature back when I lived on my grandparent land, which is a few steps away from an old Indian camping spot. The first time I saw one was probably 8 years old. At the time it was late at night, and I couldn't sleep, so I was looking out my window. And that's when I saw a car's headlights shine on this tall creature. It walked on all fours and crawled into a ditch, which is connected to the woods. The car didn't seem to react like they saw it. However, another time when I was 12, someone else saw the creature with me. We had moved to a new rural area, and I was using my telescope in my room since the moon was very bright out that night. Me and my mom saw a similar creature cross the road and go into the corn again. The cars on the road didn't react like they could see it, but me and my mom both freaked out. I told her that was the same thing I had seen before. The last time I have seen a creature like this was about 4 years later. Due to money issues, we had to move back to my grandparents' land that's next to the reservation. It was twilight out around 8 p.m. in the summer. I was having a small bonfire by myself in a meadow area on the property. I was heading inside but had to walk around a line of trees and do a bit of a U-turn, so I had to walk towards my neighbor's yard to go around the trees. And I saw something running on 2 legs very quickly in my neighbor's yard, going towards a thicket full of dead trees. At first I thought it was my neighbor, but the longer I looked, the more I noticed its features. Very pale skin, very tall, naked. I kept looking at it, non-believing what I was seeing. And as it was running, it turned and looked at me, so I freaked out and booked it to my house. I regret not watching it further, because it was about 100 or so feet from me. But I chose to run away instead. I haven't seen anything like that in a while. Pick-related, it's the only thing I found similar to it that wasn't rake-related.
Did it make any type of noise?
I've never seen them make noise before, but there was a time when we had a bonfire out in the meadow, and in the thicket area, we heard an awful scream. Every 10 or so seconds, it didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard, and we always hear foxes, bobcats, herrings nesting. But the scream was unnatural. My mother and grandmother drove on the gravel road by the river around to where the noise was coming from, and we were told to throw firecrackers into the fire every time we heard it. They said as they were driving, usually the road by the river has tons of insects, cicadas, crickets, frogs. In the summer there is a lot of noise, but it was dead silent. They drove all the way down to the thicket area, and they didn't hear the noise at all. Just the firecrackers we were throwing in the fire, every time we heard it. This was back when I was 5. So now that I think about it, I wonder if it could be related.
I saw a tall, pale-skinned being in my grandparents' yard in Willow Creek, California in 1994. I had grandparents, Dad's father and stepmother, who lived in Willow Creek until their respective passing in the early 2000s. Before then, my dad's sister and I would visit at least once or twice in the summer and sometimes for Thanksgiving or Christmas. We lived in San Jose, California at the time, which is an 8-hour drive away. We loved going to hike in the surrounding forests and playing in the Trinity River. We grew up hearing about Bigfoot. The famous Patterson video was shot in the area and the town is Bigfoot tourist heavy. But we were taught to watch out for the very real pumas and bears. I need to explain a bit about how my grandparents' house was laid out for some aspects of this story. They had a small 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house set at the corner of 2 streets. The road into the neighborhood off the main road ran along the backyard, and the house ran along the other road off of that road. Several houses ran on each side of the street, and a house sat behind their yard. Chain link fencing 6 feet tall went around their backyard and most neighbors' yards instead of solid wood fencing, so you can see into most yards. From the street and their house, it slopes down into the backyard and neighbor's yard by roughly 10 feet in total. Their backyard was mostly just grass and weeds with a small semi-growing garden near the neighbor's fence line, and a big tree, maybe oak of some kind, next to and partially over the solarium. They had a raised deck running the length of the back of the house with stairs down into the yard at one end and a solarium off their kitchen at the other end. Inside the house, the kitchen and dining room are immediately next to each other with the living room and front door next to it. At the back of the living room is a short hall with a master bedroom behind the kitchen and along the wall with the deck on one side, and the bathroom and guest room along the wall facing the side street on the other side. Grandparents, of course, got their master bedroom. Dad would take the guest room, and my sister and I would sleep in the living room in winter or in the solarium if it was summer. This story takes place in mid-August 1994. One last summer trip before school started in a couple weeks at the request of my sister for her 9th birthday earlier that month. I was 11 at the time. We left early to get there before dinner so Dad could nap from the drive a bit while me and Sis went down to the portion of the Trinity River that ran at the very back of the neighborhood. The afternoon and evening went as usual. That night we went to sleep in the solarium as was the custom for summer trips. At some point in the night I woke up. No real reason, not even to go to the bathroom. I just have always done that from time to time, even still. I did what I usually do and stared up at the stars and moon. Around half visible, couldn't tell you if it was waxing or waning. All of a sudden I got an intense feeling of dread that skipped fight or flight to straight freeze or you're dead. After some time, most likely just a minute or two, I turned my head to the side to look into the yard. I had to turn to my side and lift myself a bit to get a better look, but the source of my feeling was impossible to miss. Standing at the bottom of the yard next to the neighbor's fence line stood a tall, skinny creature with skin the color of the moon. It had no hair on its head or anywhere else that I could see. Its eyes were shiny white with a reflective quality, but not bright like a bright light was shining on them right then. Just moonlight. Its face had human features but seemed squished and flatter. Its arms seemed really long, but that could be just because it was really tall. The chain link fence came up to its armpits, so it had to be around 7 or 8 feet tall. Not enough to just step over the fencing, but I didn't hear it climb over unless it had been in the yard before I woke up and just didn't get the dread feeling until later. Its body had dirty, brown, dark gray looking rags over its chest and around its hips covering its crotch. It was looking right at me. I got scared and ducked down into my sleeping bag as far as I could. My sister has always been a heavy sleeper and I didn't want her to wake up for this anyway. The next thing I hear, heavy steps on the deck coming towards the solarium. There's a wood door with a screened window on the top of it, not opened at the time as far as I can remember. All was quiet for a while, so I peeked out through a small fold of the sleeping bag. Through one of the bottom windows of the solarium next to the door, I saw its pale, large feet. The skin was rough and the toes were gnarled with dirty nails. I curled up trying not to make a sound or move much. The bag was getting stuffy. The next thing I know, my dad is gently moving me with his foot, asking if I was cold because I was still huddled down into the bag. I looked around kind of disoriented. There was no evidence of that creature from the night before. No marks or footprints or bent fencing. My dad was a huge skeptic of anything paranormal, cryptic, and otherworldly, but I told him anyway. He, of course, blew it off as a dream. Sis, being a deep sleeper, didn't notice anything. I asked my grandparents if they heard or felt the thumping on the deck, which would have been along their bedroom wall. Nope. Both seemed weirded out by my story, and my grandma later privately told me, "There's lots of strange things up here. That's why we avoid being out at night." She wouldn't elaborate, though.
This happened back in the summer of 2013 when I was 13. My mom and I were in Florida visiting my grandma and aunt. After spending the week or so at Grandma's place in Odessa, we drove north to St. Augustine to spend the next week at a hotel by the beach and visit with my aunt as well. On the second night there, we were driving to pick up my aunt who was working the night shift at Denny's. On the drive, a guy was walking down the road with his back facing us with a backpack and all, possibly homeless. It was dark and right by a stretch of wood, so my mom didn't see him at first and nearly hit him. When she notices and swerves to avoid the vehicular manslaughter charges, I look out the window to see who this guy is. Nothing about the guy walking seemed out of the ordinary. It's what I saw behind him that still sticks with me. It was this humanoid creature that was crouched down, looking like it might have already been eating something. Keep in mind I was in a moving vehicle, so I couldn't get the best look at it, but it almost looked to have old ripped-up clothes on and a bit of hair on its head, like a human. But its eyes were huge. They glowed too, like when you see an animal's eyes looking at you at night. When it looked up, it snarled and I could almost see its teeth. They looked sharp, like they could bite right through you with no effort. Its skin was almost white with a tint of green and looked skinny and long, the knees up to its head when crouching. It had to have been no more than 10 feet away from the pedestrian walking on the side of the road. It took me a minute to register what I just saw, and if it was even what I thought it was, which I still, almost 12 years later, couldn't tell you. I was just quiet and in shock for the rest of the night. My mom, aunt, and I went back to the hotel room. They drank and caught up while I just tried to watch TV and not think about what I saw that night. I still don't know what I saw. My knowledge of Florida cryptids is very limited.
This happened when I lived in a children's home in a more remote part of the town in Finland. It was at the start of winter, around the end of December 2017. The house is located in the woods, but has many houses close to each other. I had to walk to a side road in the woods to smoke my cigarette since it wasn't allowed to smoke on the property. It was already dark, but the road was dimly lit by the lights of one of the houses. This is the part I always felt uneasy walking. I was almost back at the house when I started feeling really uneasy again, but this time it was intense. I felt something watching me. I heard a branch break and some leaves crunching, and saw this bizarre-looking thing walking from the woods, over the road and back to the woods on the other side. It was pale grayish on all fours, but the legs were weird, like humanoid, but at the same time the knees bent like a dog. The front legs were mostly the same, but not so bent. The body was slim and the back was kind of arched, like upwards. The head is so hard to describe. It was kind of humanoid too, but had no human features or ears. I focused mainly on the legs because they looked so wrong. It didn't make any sounds or didn't smell like anything. I was close enough to see details, but not close enough to smell, if it smelled like anything closer. I stood there, my heart was pounding and I wanted to scream and run home. But I couldn't because the thing was on the way. It was slow too, like the average human speed when walking. After it was gone, I ran back home and told a friend who told me he always felt uneasy there. What could it be? I really want some answers. I tried to draw it, the legs were slimmer.
I live in North Carolina, Durham specifically. My family lives in a standard 2-story house in the middle of a run-of-the-mill neighborhood, lots of intersecting roads, etc. On the night of the question, my family was going to visit a relative who had given birth recently in Greensboro, so I had the house to myself. I was getting home at around 8 or 9 p.m. and decided to bring my dog in. She stays outside in the kennel for the day until we bring her in for the night. Our house has a garage attached to the left of it, and the garage has a back door that leads into the backyard. Her kennel is just to your right as you exit the door, with a 4-5 feet clearance path between it and the garage. There is also a bed of rock just up against the house, which will be important. She had recently been taken to the vet for her distressed behavior, which is why I had to stay home to be with her. The evening went fine. I watched a movie to pass the time. I then took her out to use the bathroom before being put up for the night, around 12 or 1. I took her out the back garage door with her long leash. I was wearing socks and didn't feel like getting them soaked. She usually does her business in that little clearing between the kennel and garage, so I let her walk through it. Our garage has a single light on the back wall, not LED or really bright, so I can see her somewhat well while she does it. She's facing me when suddenly her backside lifts almost 1 or 2 feet into the air. I assumed some wild dog or something had tried to drag her. She runs back to me and I hear rustling among the rocks, and this figure stops right as it enters a visible view in the light. I've never seen anything like it in my life. It was tall. I'm 6'2" and I had to look slightly up to see where I thought its head was. It was pale, but not white or gray, just a normal pale flesh color, like someone who spends a week or 2 indoors. It was lanky, not really anorexic or anything, but definitely disproportionate. It looked at me for a good 1 or 2 seconds before it backtracked in the quickest manner I could ever replicate. As soon as it went, I booked it back inside. I was torn about calling the police if neighbors who had heard my scream hadn't. Behold, almost half an hour later, the police arrive in my driveway. I told them that I had seen a man in the backyard, leaving out the whole tall demon crap going on. I have been contemplating whether it was some creature or some meth head.
In 2015, I was driving back from an ex-partner's house at about 11 p.m. in rural Lancashire in the north of England. It was late November from what I remember, so it was a clear night, with a big bright moon and very cold out, for England at least. To get to my home, you have to cut off the motorway and take a slightly rural route up a wooded road. It's not a large or dense wood. You can probably walk from one end to the other in 15 or 20 minutes. It's roughly a 5-minute drive through the trees. As I was driving along, the road twisted and turned as it always had the hundreds of other times I had used it. So I had to drive very slowly, about 20 kilometers per hour, in case a car came around a bend too fast. There's always accidents there. And so I was raising and dipping my headlights and full beam as you do. As I turned a corner, about 30 feet in front of my car was a large, scrawny grey figure. At first, I thought it was a large branch that had fallen from the tree, so I crept toward it and put on my full beam. When I got within about 10 feet of it, the creature, or whatever it was, moved as though it was doing a press-up, pushing itself up with its arms, and my headlights caught its eyes, which glowed like a cat does when you shine a light at them at night. I stopped the car, half expecting it to just be a deer, and ran out of the way. But the creature didn't move. It just stayed stationary, staring at me, giving me a good 15 seconds to look at it. It then slowly stood up on 2 legs, still looking at me in the car. It was big. The top of my car probably only reached the lower ribcage region, so I'd estimate it was probably 9 to 10 feet tall. It was pale grey, hairless and gaunt. I could see its ribcage and spine. It had long, bony arms, probably each about 4 feet long, and large, claw-like hands. Once I'd taken all this in and realised the situation, I began to panic, putting my car in reverse, but the creature then just turned and walked calmly and silently off into the woods next to the road. It did not run. It didn't seem scared or intimidated. It almost seemed disinterested. I didn't hang about to investigate the area. I went straight home and locked the door. I spoke to all my friends, and all but one of them thought I was joking, but she seemed to take it very, very seriously, having had a similar experience in a similar area a few years ago. She said it was a bad omen, and after doing some research, I can understand why. As I said, I don't really believe in anything, and I've never seen anything before. I travel that road at least once or twice a week and have never seen anything since. Does anyone have any idea what it could have been? We don't have large animals over here in the UK. The biggest we get in my area are badgers and small and medium-sized deer. Certainly not that size, and surely deer would startle in the headlights and run.
Gonna be honest, I'm not very impressed by these things. Yeah, they're fast, they're carnivores, they look like people. But all things considered, they're absolutely not anywhere near the top of the food chain. Crawlers are creepy, yeah, but they don't really have the muscle mass or the adaptations to take down big game. Deer, moose, boars, these are all animals that weigh hundreds of pounds. For that kind of game, you need more than just a creepy smile and some claws. You need muscle, the lack of which is kind of one of these things' defining traits. The mouths are often described as small, not that good for inflicting a big deadly bite. Maybe a crawler could get the drop on a deer from above and get a kill, but that's not going to be a reliable source of food. The same goes for just eating people. Even if they were consistently chowing down on crackheads and lost kids, there's just not enough people out there to sustain a population of these things. The logical answer is that these things are, well, like us. That is, generalists. They're almost certainly going after smaller meals that they can cram into their mouths or carry off. Birds, small mammals, fruit, maybe baby deer. It's all stuff that requires them to move around constantly as they look for enough food to match the calories they're consuming as they chase you guys around. There's similar creatures like that today with things like cougars and jumping spiders. Larger game isn't out of the question, but if they go for it, it's probably going to be relatively infrequent, and the bodies are likely dragged up into trees or something as food caches like leopards. Why? Because crawlers aren't alone in the woods and there's things that can eat them. Bears, I'm sorry, but there is no goddamn way that one of these chicken-legged, rail-thin, 120 pounds tops creatures is going to come out on top against a full-grown bear. These things are solid blocks of muscle and fur. A crawler just isn't going to match that. But it's not predation that I'm thinking about with bears, it's competition. Bears are going to be eating the same stuff a crawler's eating, and they're big enough that they can just wait out leaner times with built-up fat deposits. But most importantly, they can handle the cold. A bear's got thick fur and hide, dense muscle, and layers of fat to keep it warm, not to mention being able to just nap through the snow. Crawlers? They don't really have anything to keep from turning into ass-naked popsicles. They're going to need to find shelter from the snow, and that's going to put them into further competition with bears. So how do we solve this problem? The crawlers seem up shit creek without a paddle. Until you remember two things. One, crawlers are climbers. That means that they can make use of caves much more so than bears. And what do you know? Major hotspots of crawler activity coincide with areas like the Appalachians and the Sierra Nevada mountains, spots where there's tons of caves and tunnels. People go missing in these spots all the time, eaten by the hungry earth, but a crawler could navigate these tunnels easily, feeding on the carrion and keeping itself hidden throughout harsher seasons without worrying about a grizzly rocking its shit. Which brings me to the other factor, namely, the fact that we wiped out most of the big predators of North America and filled the woods with homes for them. Abandoned buildings, crack dens, mine shafts, basements, hunting blinds, garden sheds. We've crammed the goddamn woods full of places where a crawler could hide from the worst of the weather, while simultaneously providing them with more food that they know they can easily access on a regular basis. Pets, chicken coops, garbage dumps, food waste, even stuff like fruit orchards and crop fields and the stuff that gets tossed out from there for not being good enough for consumers. It's all stuff that could very easily feed generalist creatures like crawlers, and they're absolutely smart enough to figure that out, especially given that they don't seem afraid of people. What's more, we've also handily wiped out most of their major predators and competitors. Bears and wolves and cougars used to spread from coast to coast, but now they're reduced to just a handful of spots. It's the same process that led to coyotes conquering the continent, and honestly, those animals seem to be a pretty good model for the crawler. They're not unkillable super monsters, they're coyotes that happen to be shaped like people.
The disturbing thing about crawlers to me actually is that they might have a small, weak bite. If you look at monkeys or chimps who hunt prey, you have to consider that they absolutely suck at it. What this means is that their prey often suffers terribly. Just look at what chimps do to monkeys they catch. What this means for any largish prey that a crawler gets a hold of, a deer caught slipping, or a human, is they won't go painlessly. They'd probably be bludgeoned with those long arms, pulled apart or gutted, and have to feel the experience of a lot of ineffectual bites. Not a good way to go. In that respect, they're also not too unlike coyotes, so that was a good comparison. Also, you have to factor in that wiry, lanky primates are often way stronger than they look, and a crawler would be no exception. To be sure, I'd agree they would be generalist feeders and spend a lot of time foraging, hunting small game, or licking scum off of cave walls or whatever. But I wouldn't underestimate one as a threat either. And they're one of those things where the closer they might be to humans, the worse they get. We all know what humans are capable of. You can just imagine what our cave-dwelling cousins might get into. Agreed also that they would be BTFO by bears and likely wolves and cougars, let alone Bigfoot and dogmen. Mind you, chimps and monkeys do actually have very powerful jaws, and that's reflected in their skulls. A crawler just doesn't have the necessary attachment points. The head is always small and rounded, no sagittal crest or cheekbones to attach powerful jaw muscles. That said, even chimps are much bulkier than you'd expect them to be. I admit that I may be underselling the crawler, especially if they could use things like flint scrapes or rocks, but they just do not have the equipment to really be a consistent threat to a person.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.